Welcome back, everybody.
Yes, welcome back to Lush
Lush
Life.
Life, no labels.
I'm Michelle.
And this is Alfredo. Thank you for coming back to our fifth episode at this point.
No, it's our sixth episode.
Oh, okay. Our sixth episode. So let's hear Michelle give her story of the week. It's our segue into our topic.
So I'll be moving this week and I'm excited. I'm stressed out about packing up and all of that, but I'm particularly excited because this is going to be my first time living alone since graduating from college.
So this whole time since you were, I guess, 22 or so, let's say, you've been living with roommates.
Yes, I have.
Wow, that's a big change then, so I understand.
Yeah, and you've actually had more experience living alone more recently, right?
Well, I'm the same as you. So basically, I've always had roommates my whole life. I've either lived with family or with roommates or friends. And recently, when I moved here to Florida in December, that was when I moved to live alone for the first time in forever, I guess. So it's been a new experience for me living by myself. And that's really what our topic is. We're talking about housing, roommates, living alone, and the kind of situation that people are dealing with, especially millennials and younger age people in trying to find housing and, what choices we even have.
So while I'm excited about living alone, I'm also a bit nervous because this is going to be the most I've spent on any given rent per month since I've lived anywhere. It's interesting because I've wanted to live alone for a long time, even before business school, but I couldn't afford it. So part of, I think, for a lot of people, you live with roommates because it's just simply too expensive to live by yourself and to take on the entire burden of a whole apartment.
Exactly, because when you live alone, you're not just paying the rent by yourself, you have to furnish the apartment, you're paying for the Wi-Fi, the electricity, water, everything separately. At least with roommates, you can share those costs.
Exactly. And I'm curious, when you lived in Spain versus here, what is the rent difference? Is it cheaper to live there and get a better apartment? Because I know that with friends of mine who live across America in different cities, we all have different, even though it's expensive for everyone, the apartments that you get for the cost are not always equivalent to the quality of the actual apartment.
It's interesting. I've had both experiences, like living in the US, living in Spain, and I think that it's really a global problem that's not limited to any country. Like all over the world, rent and housing is really expensive and it's inaccessible for a lot of people. And that's why people are stuck living with their families or they're living with roommates. It's sort of the economic situation. Just what wages are is not enough for most people to pay for housing that they can afford. So in Spain, I think it's even more common than in the US for people to have roommates. And I do get this impression from talking to different people where, in Spain, I lived with random people many times. There's even a website called Idealista. There are multiple where you go on to find roommates and kind of get matched. And it's sort of like they choose who wants to come into the apartment and there's sort of like a casting to get into the apartment. But I think in Europe, living with random people there is even more common.
I've had roommates for a long time since I went to boarding school and then I went to college and had there were years where I had roommates that who were my friends and roommates who were random and assigned to me freshman. And then post school, I chose every roommate I had. Some were friends and some weren't. So I would say I've definitely had a similar range of living with random people, but I've also lived with some friends.
I would add the caveat to what I said that in the US, that for many people it's common to have roommates in university, but once you graduate, that's usually when people live alone. Where in Spain, people into their 20s and 30s will have roommates, and it's quite normal. And
Okay.
even with random people, I don't feel that that's as common.
Yeah. And of course, this is also, we know that there are people who are coupled up in long term relationships or married or partnered. So there are people who are together who live together as well. They don't live alone, but they're also with a random.
Or you could live with friends, obviously, but
Exactly.
sometimes, whatever given life situation, you don't have that option either, and you do live with random people. And, having roommates can be a good or bad thing, but I think what's interesting to think about is in society, in pop culture, I feel like we're kind of taught from early on that it's something that we should aim to achieve of like I'm gonna get my own place, I'm gonna live alone. And obviously living alone is has a lot of benefits and it's nice to feel independent and you have your own space to do whatever you want. But I
Would you say
also
that's one of the pros of living alone since you live alone now?
those are definitely pros, but I do question what this culture of, this is something you need to achieve to be fulfilled. And if you have a roommate when you're 30, you're a failure. And
Mm-hmm.
I think about that kind of pressure in light of the economic situation we're in, where housing has never been this expensive. There's so much inflation. It's really expensive to live. And I bet people maybe they feel bad about themselves when they can't achieve that goal of living alone.
I do think there are people who think that of themselves, but I've also spoken with friends who are in these situations and it's just circumstance. And I do think that people understand that things are just harder, especially for millennials at this point with as people get older. So I don't think everyone necessarily is feeling bad for themselves. I think people understand the circumstances and COVID happened. A lot of people's living situations changed, economic circumstances changed. So it makes sense. But I do want to go back and talk a little bit about our pros and cons of living alone versus living with roommates, because I'm sure the listeners have had different experiences. As you mentioned, people who went to school in America, they certainly have examples of good and bad roommate situations. So let's talk a little bit about yours. Do you have some pros of living with roommates?
Pros and cons, yeah. For pros, I would say like we already mentioned, these past 8 months or so have been the first time that I've lived alone. And it can be freeing to do whatever you want with your apartment. For example, when I've had roommates, you can't just leave a dirty dish in the sink if you're in a hurry running out because it's inconsiderate. For example, I guess you could do that and they're a bad roommate. But what I mean is, I have the freedom to, cook in the morning, leave everything a mess because I'm in a hurry and just run out. And then I don't have to worry about being yelled at for leaving a dirty pot or a dirty dish in the sink. And
Mm-hmm.
that's nice. And you can always keep the apartment to your own cleanliness level. You keep it the way you want it to be. When you have roommates, sometimes the cleanliness standards are not matched up and that can be a problem. So knowing that you're responsible for the space and how it is and can keep it exactly how you want it and do whatever you want with it, that is really nice. But not everything has been good about or living alone, I'm sorry.
So, what are some cons of living alone?
I think it can be lonely actually. And I think that depends on you as a person because some people like more social interaction, some people are more extroverted, some people are more introverted. But when I think about all the times I've had roommates, I've enjoyed, you might go into your room to have quiet time, but then you could go out to the kitchen or the living room and,
And
you
have a
know,
social interaction.
where now I live alone, I have to leave my apartment for a social interaction. And I think with COVID and everything that happened, that's something I think about more where, during COVID I had roommates and that could have been a very lonely time because you're stuck in your house, people weren't interacting that much. But because I had roommates during COVID, it was actually a very positive experience because my home in itself was a very social environment. So I didn't feel lonely at all to experience. And
How
so I
many
think,
how many roommates did you have during this environment?
okay, so this was a little bit of a crazy life choice of mine, and it could have gone horribly wrong, but it didn't. But I decided to move into a 7 bedroom apartment with 3 bathrooms and a giant kitchen.
Most
And this
people's
was
houses don't even have 7 bedrooms,
seven
unless you're from, what is that show from Christmas about that kid whose parents left him behind and took the
Home
entire
Alone. Home
Home
Alone.
Alone? There you go. From the 80s or I don't know, before my time.
Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking, and I think I had trouble finding apartments, and it was a reasonable price. The location was good, so I
So
signed a lease to live in this 12 bed, no, I'm sorry, 7 bedroom apartment with 3 couples, and then the rest of the rooms were individuals.
what a time.
No, but it was actually really fun. Like it kind of felt like
A hotel room? A hotel?
yeah, we would joke that it was like a commune, a hippie commune. Because it was like people from different countries, like there was a gay couple, 2 straight couples, like all kinds of mixes of people, and there was always someone to hang out with. So that was actually a really positive experience, but obviously it could go it could have gone very wrong. Luckily, it didn't. I don't know if I would do it again, but I'm glad I did.
Mhm.
But
That's a
that's
really
definitely a
roommate, especially during COVID, where the rest of the world is literally isolating. So, do you think that it went well because you had that community during a time when the entire world was shut down?
Definitely. I think it felt good to have community, and I'm a very extroverted person. I like to be around people a lot. And I think that it would have been really hard for me to go through that whole time where people didn't really want to interact. I think it would have been a very difficult time for me. And I think that that applies in general to this question of living alone or living with roommates. When you have roommates, you always have this social interaction in your house without having to seek it out. This is kind of bringing everything back to what I said about how we're always taught that you achieve something by living alone. I was recently reading the New York Times, and they were talking about the epidemic of loneliness in the US. And I think that part of this push to, everybody live alone, have your own house, have your own apartment can sort of cause loneliness too, because when you live in a more communal environment where you're around people in your living space, it's not like you have to go out of your way to plan social engagements with other people where you're interacting. And I think that that is something I've thought about even more with COVID. So it's definitely really nice to live alone, but if you're a social person, you are forced to kind of make more of an effort to have social
Interactions outside of
engagements.
the
Yeah,
home. Yeah, for sure. And there are fun, as you said just now, there are the fun parts of living with roommates, but also there are the parts of having your own space when you live alone, which is great. But there are also cons of having roommates. You mentioned this before. If you have a different standard of cleanliness than someone else, that can create issues because you're sharing the same common spaces, the same kitchen, the same bathroom, the same wherever else. And so it can get dicey when there are differences with how someone might be an early bird and makes noises in the morning, but you'd prefer to sleep in, or vice versa. So I do think there are some cons to living with roommates, but as you mentioned, with the what society tells you and what the economy is, it can be difficult to live the way that you may want. And I do think the other thing too is that society also not just living alone, but it does encourage people to get partnered up, get married, have kids, and then you wouldn't live alone because now you're with your family. And so some people may be going down that route, but I do think with roommates and alone, most of us are trying to figure out what's the best thing for us and what are the standards that we prefer to live in. And some people, I have friends who love living with people, not because of economy or anything, but they just prefer, as you said, to have this constant social interaction with. So they could afford to live alone, but they prefer not to because they want people around. And that's
exactly. And that's why it really goes to knowing what's important for you, what you like. But kind of getting back to what you said, you're about to move. You haven't lived alone before. This is kind of a big change for you, and I'm excited for you because it is a good experience to have, even if in the end you decide you want room. But what kind of pushed you to move out after all of this time, since you've always been?
I've wanted to live alone for a long time, even before business school. One of the reasons I wanted to go to business school was because I wanted a job that would pay me enough to be able to live and afford the rent prices of where I live in Northeast America. So part of my push was definitely economic, but I prefer not prefer I like to spend a lot of time by myself. I'm also extroverted. So I think the word is ambivert. You're both. So for me, I have periods where I want to go out, I want to meet people, things like that. But then I have times where I want to be alone. And for living, I have certain standards that I want to live for myself. And being alone means I can decide how I live and I can do whatever I want with my time and I've wanted because I've had to share my space for so long, I've just had a very strong desire to have something that is just for me in a sense.
No, that's really understandable. And I think it's a good experience to have no matter what. But one thing I've learned about having your own space that was different for me because I've always shared apartments, so you don't totally feel ownership over the space because it's not fully yours. But when it's
Exactly.
your apartment, you have to choose how you keep it and how you want to decorate it, furnish it, what stuff you want to put
So
on
would
the
you say
wall.
there are more decisions that you make when you live?
For sure. Maybe it's not necessary, but for example, if you rent an apartment and there are no decorations whatsoever, like my apartment is pretty stark. There's not a lot of decorations, but when I moved in, I realized I need to kind of, add some pictures, add a post, put, a refrigerator magnet so it feels like someone lives here, otherwise it feels like there's nothing, like
No
no
one
one
lives.
lives here. So that was different for me.
That's one thing I'm excited about too is growing up, I didn't decorate where I lived, but that's something that over time I realized I wanted to try to do, but I wanted to have the space to do that and feel like I don't need to compromise it or figure out if someone else likes it or doesn't like it.
What
So
what kind of things are you thinking about putting in the house? Why don't you
I
get
want to put up paintings. Some have been gifted, some I found like on the side of the road. I
why don't you put you could get one of those pictures of the Eiffel Tower and put it on.
I don't want to do that. I would actually put up, so one of my hobbies is hiking. And so I would put up photos of the mountains actually that I took. I want to actually get one of those maps where the scratch off maps. I want to get one of the US to scratch off all of the places I've been to and then also of the countries of the world. The more I get closer to it, I'm just really excited to have a place where I can experiment on how I want things to look and what kind of furniture I want.
For sure. But it's just sometimes it's funny to me when you go to people's house. And I have to say my apartment is pretty minimalist by choice, but also because I'm cheap. So there's not a lot of decorations. But sometimes you go to people's houses and it's so tacky. Like, like that's why I said, they'll have like a picture of Big Ben or like the Eiffel Tower or something very generic.
Maybe
But
they like
they have bad taste. But yeah, I think you should get those like a vase and those fake flowers for your
like the
apartment.
fake flowers. Actually, you know what I'm gonna do? I want to order Lego because I love flowers. I had an Instagram where I have my flower photos that I took, but I actually don't prefer to receive flowers or have them because to me they just die too quickly and I feel bad. So I prefer to have fake flowers, but I actually want to do the Lego flowers and see if I can build that. And
It's
that's
funny.
going to be on my kitchen table.
It's funny that you say that now because I remember in that 12-person apartment I lived in Spain, it was like the owners clearly just wanted to furnish it as cheaply as possible and rent out the room. And,
Mhm.
and all of the furniture was just IKEA. And I remember that they had the every room just had this fake IKEA plastic cactus, and it just did not fit. And it was just like every room has this like IKEA plastic cactus. And I was
At
just
least they
like,
tried.
wow. So maybe you should get a bunch of like IKEA plastic cactus for your apartment.
I don't just want cacti around my apartment though. I feel like my Lego orchid and my Lego gardens was sufficient.
Yeah, and that's original. It kind of shows your personal taste as
It
well.
definitely does. Although I'm gonna need some help building that because some of those look very complicated.
That'll be a fun activity. You can go build Lego.
Build Legos. And with some wine, or wine and Lego.
or other stuff. All right, everybody. This is a little bit of a shorter episode, but wrapping things up now, what I would like to have everybody think about is all of the different living experiences that you've had over the years. I'm sure people have lived with family, they've lived with roommates, maybe they've lived alone, and also maybe you lived in different types of apartments. Maybe you lived in a really nice house or a really shitty apartment. I can say I've lived in a lot of shitty places.
I
So,
have.
so you've had these different experiences and also you've lived with different types of roommates. Maybe you were raised a certain way with a certain cleanliness level. My question would be, how well do you know yourself and what your living standards and your living preferences, what is it that makes you feel comfortable in the space you're in? Does it have to be a certain level of cleanliness? Are you more clean? Do you have to live alone? Do you want to live in a nice apartment? What are the living standards and preferences that you've formed over the years? And also, how has that changed? For one thing that Michelle told me this when she came to visit me, she said, "Wow, like your apartment is so bougie."
It is bougie.
Yeah, there's the espresso maker
There's
and
the hot chocolate. Ah, I love it.
there's like a hot chocolate espresso
My daily
machine.
dose of hot chocolate.
That's
Yeah,
for me, this apartment I'm living in now is the nicest apartment I've ever lived in my whole life. And so getting back to that, your standards change where now I'm used to living in a nice apartment. And I think if I were to go back and, live in some of the other places I have, I'd be like, ooh, like, I can't stay here. But, things change over time. So I want you to think about, all the experiences you've had and how your own preferences have changed over time.
for sure. And the other thing to think about too, because we want to be practical, is what makes you the most comfortable. And comfortability can come in a different way, in different ways. But think about where you live in terms of financially comfortable. Sometimes, at least in my case, I wanted to live in a certain place, but I couldn't afford it. So you have to think about what makes you most financially comfortable in addition to the quality in apartment or location. So we'll sign off with that for today.
Thank you for tuning in again.
Thank you. This is Michelle.
This is Alfredo, and thanks for listening to Lush Life.
No
No
labels.
labels. Have a
See you
good
next
week.
time.
Living with random people there is even more common.